Shimla, the Queen of Hills, is known for its breathtaking beauty, but beneath the mist and pine trees lies a darker side. Ghostly whispers echo through abandoned buildings, shadowy figures roam lonely roads, and some places hold secrets too terrifying to forget. These are real tales, accounts from those who dared to explore Shimla's haunted past. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and prepare yourself for pure terror. Story 1. The Ghost of Tunnel Number 33. Deep in the hills of Shimla lies Tunnel Number 33, infamous for its eerie silence and ghostly sightings. One cold winter night, a railway engineer named Rajiv took a shortcut through the tunnel to reach his home faster. Halfway in, his torchlight flickered, and he saw a man in an old British-era coat staring at him. The figure whispered, "They left me behind." Terrified, Rajiv ran, but as he turned back, the man had vanished. The next morning, railway workers told him about the ghost of Colonel Barog, a British engineer who shot himself in shame when the tunnel construction went wrong. Locals say his spirit still roams the tunnel, seeking peace. Story 2. Charleville Mansion's Invisible Intruder. In 1913, an English officer named Victor Bailey moved into the infamous Charleville Mansion, unaware of its terrifying past. He dismissed the locals' warnings about a spirit that walked the halls at midnight. One evening, he locked his study before bed. The next morning, he found the room in complete disarray, books scattered, furniture overturned. Thinking it was an intruder, he installed a security system. That night, he heard heavy footsteps outside his bedroom door. When he flung it open, the corridor was empty, but the walls bore fresh scratch marks, as if something had tried to claw its way inside. Story 3. The Vanishing Woman of Chudail Baudi. On the winding roads near Chudail Baudi, taxi drivers warned travelers never to stop for a woman in white. A young couple ignored this warning one monsoon night. They saw a woman drenched in rain, waving for help. Feeling pity, they let her in. As the car moved, the woman remained eerily silent. When the driver glanced at the rearview mirror, his heart stopped. The woman had no face. Panicked, he swerved, crashing the car. When they woke up, the woman was gone. Locals say she was a bride who died in a tragic accident, forever searching for someone to take her home. Story 4. The Cursed Cottage in Bharari. A family from Delhi rented an old cottage in Bharari for a peaceful vacation. On their first night, the youngest son woke up screaming. He claimed a tall, shadowy figure had been standing at the foot of his bed. The parents dismissed it as a nightmare. The next night, they heard loud thuds from the attic, though no one had access to it. On the third night, the mother saw a reflection in the bathroom mirror, an old woman with hollow eyes staring back at her. They fled the next morning. Later, they learned that a woman had been murdered in that very cottage, and her restless spirit still lingered. Story 5. The Whispering Pines of Mashobra. A trekking group camped in the dense forests of Mashobra, known for its towering deodar trees. At midnight, they heard whispers carried by the wind, though no one was nearby. A young man wandered a few steps away and screamed. When the others found him, he was standing motionless, eyes wide in terror. He said he saw a shadowy figure with elongated fingers reaching for him. Locals later told them the forest was cursed. A British-era logging company once forced workers to stay overnight, and many vanished without a trace. Their voices, some say, still echo through the pines. Story 6. The Forgotten Sanatorium of Kufri. In the 1940s, a tuberculosis sanatorium stood in Kufri, where many patients spent their final days in agony. One such patient, a nurse named Leela, succumbed to the disease but vowed to care for the sick even in death. Decades later, a group of hikers stumbled upon the abandoned ruins of the sanatorium. That night, one of them woke up gasping for breath, feeling unseen hands pressing down on his chest. His friends found him barely conscious, mumbling about a woman in a nurse's uniform who tried to help him. The locals believe that Leela's spirit still wanders the ruins, searching for patients to care for. Story 7. The Watcher of Elysium Hill. A journalist named Arjun checked into a quiet guesthouse near Elysium Hill to work on a story about Shimla's ghostly past. The first night, he heard knocking on his window, though he was staying on the top floor. Ignoring it, he continued his research. The next evening, his laptop screen flickered, and words appeared. "Leave while you can." Assuming it was a prank, he stayed. That night, he felt a weight on his chest and woke up gasping. Standing by the bed was a faceless figure, its long fingers reaching towards him. He fled the next morning, never completing his story. Story 8. The Howling Ruins of Peterhoff. Once a grand residence, Peterhoff now stands as a government building, but its past is steeped in mystery. A night guard reported hearing faint howling sounds echoing through the empty corridors. One evening, he saw a woman in colonial-era clothing staring at him from a broken window. When he rushed to check, the room was locked from the inside. The next morning, an old caretaker revealed the story of a British woman who had died mysteriously in the building, and her spirit, restless and filled with sorrow, still haunts its ruins. Story 9. The Mysterious Lodger at Oakwood House. A couple rented a room at the historic Oakwood House in Shimla. On the first night, they heard someone pacing outside their door. Thinking it was another guest, they ignored it. The next night, the pacing continued, but when they checked, the hallway was empty. On the third night, the wife awoke to see a shadowy figure standing at the foot of their bed, staring. They fled the next morning. The hotel staff later admitted that guests often complained about a former lodger who died there, and never truly checked out. Story 10. The Crying Child of Summerhill. A group of students from Shimla University went exploring the forested trails of Summerhill when they heard the faint sound of a child crying. As they followed the noise, it led them to an old, abandoned well. One student claimed to see a small hand reaching out from the depths. Panicked, they ran back, only to find a local who told them the legend of a young boy who had fallen into the well decades ago. His spirit, they say, still cries for help on lonely nights. Story 11. The Shadow at Jakhoo Temple. A tourist named Ankit visited Jakhoo Temple, known for its giant Hanuman statue. After sunset, he decided to take a shortcut down the forested path. Halfway through, he felt someone following him, soft footsteps mimicking his own. Turning around, he saw a dark figure crouching near the trees, its glowing eyes fixed on him. Frozen in fear, he whispered a prayer, and suddenly, the bells from the temple rang loudly. When he looked back, the figure was gone. Locals say the forest is home to an ancient entity that preys on lone travelers at dusk. Story 12. The Whispering Ghost of Gaiety Theatre. The historic Gaiety Theatre in Shimla has long been rumored to be haunted. During a late-night rehearsal, an actress heard someone whispering her lines from the empty balcony. Assuming it was a crew member, she ignored it. But as she performed, she felt an invisible hand brush against her arm. Panicked, she turned, and saw the reflection of a woman in an old Victorian gown staring at her from the mirror. She ran out, screaming. Staff later revealed that a British actress had died tragically during a performance, and her spirit never left the stage. Story 13. The Ghost Train of Barog Station. A retired railway officer shared his terrifying experience at Barog Station, a quiet stop near Shimla. One foggy night, he saw an old steam engine approaching the platform, except there was no scheduled train. As the ghostly train slowed, he glimpsed shadowy passengers sitting inside, their faces blurred. Just as suddenly, the train vanished into the night. The next morning, he learned that an entire train had derailed in the mountains decades ago, killing everyone on board. Some say it still runs on misty nights, searching for its lost destination. Story 14. The Cursed Painting of Rothney Castle. A historian researching Rothney Castle discovered a dusty painting in an abandoned room. It depicted a woman with piercing eyes and a cryptic smile. That night, he felt an icy presence in his room. Waking up, he saw the painting had fallen off the wall, its canvas now blank. He fled the house, and when he returned with locals, the painting was back in its frame, unchanged. It is said the woman in the painting was a British officer's wife who was betrayed and murdered, and her cursed portrait absorbs the souls of those who stare too long. Story 15. The Silent Child of the Cecil Hotel. A honeymooning couple checked into a luxurious room at the famous Cecil Hotel. In the middle of the night, the husband woke up to see a little girl standing by the window, staring outside. Assuming she was a guest child, he approached, but she turned slowly, her eyes hollow and dark. The next morning, hotel staff dismissed his story but admitted that in the 1920s, a young girl had fallen from the very same window. Her spirit, they say, still lingers, waiting for someone to hold her hand. Story 16. The Wailing Widow of the Ridge. A group of friends strolled along the ridge after a late-night party when they heard soft crying near Christ Church. They saw a woman in a dark shawl sitting on a bench, sobbing. As they approached, she suddenly stopped crying and looked up, her face pale, her eyes empty. Before they could react, she vanished into thin air. Terrified, they rushed home and later learned of an old story about a grieving widow who had lost her husband in a tragic accident and was seen wandering the area even after her death. Story 17. The Phantom Hitchhiker of Sanjauli. A taxi driver was driving through Sanjauli late at night when he saw a man waving for a ride. The man got in but remained silent. As they approached the destination, the driver looked into the mirror and found the back seat empty. Shaken, he stopped the car, only to find a newspaper on the seat, its front page showing the face of the man he had picked up. The date? The anniversary of his death. Story 18. The Drowning Spirit of Tattapani. A group of friends visited the hot springs of Tattapani for a weekend getaway. While taking a dip in the river, one of them felt something grab his ankle, pulling him under. His friends pulled him out, but he gasped. "I saw her. She was trying to drag me down." Locals later told them about a woman who had drowned in the river years ago, and her ghost was known to haunt the waters, searching for a companion to take with her. Story 19. The Blood-Soaked Hands of Bantony Castle. A journalist sneaked into the abandoned Bantony Castle to investigate reports of paranormal activity. Inside, he found an old wooden chair facing a dusty mirror. As he turned away, he saw movement in the reflection, blood-stained hands reaching toward him. When he spun around, the chair was empty. Rushing out, he later discovered the castle had been used as a torture chamber during colonial times, and many unfortunate souls had met there and there. Story 20. The Possessed Doll of Lakkar Bazaar. A shopkeeper in Lakkar Bazaar found an antique wooden doll among old stock. One night, he heard faint giggles in the store. The next morning, he found the doll moved from its shelf, sitting on the counter. Thinking it was a prank, he locked it away, but the following night, the giggles returned. The next morning, the doll was back on the counter, with its head slightly tilted as if watching him. Fearing the worst, he threw it into the river. But a week later, the same doll appeared at his shop's doorstep. Story 21. The Hitchhiker of Cart Road. A taxi driver working late on Cart Road picked up a young woman who asked to be dropped at Lakkar Bazaar. She barely spoke, just nodded and pointed. As they neared the destination, she vanished from the back seat. The terrified driver slammed the brakes and ran to the police station. When he described the woman, an officer sighed and said, "You're not the first." Years ago, a girl had died in a hit-and-run at the very spot where he had picked her up. Story 22. The Weeping Nurse of IGMC. A doctor working night shifts at Indira Gandhi Medical College Hospital heard soft sobbing in the empty ICU ward. He followed the sound and saw a nurse in an old uniform standing in the dimly lit corridor. When he called out, she turned, a ghastly, decomposed face staring back at him. He fainted. The next morning, senior staff revealed that she was a nurse who had died in a tragic fire years ago, but never stopped attending to her patients. Story 23. The Silent Classroom of Bishop Cotton School. A teacher at the historic Bishop Cotton School stayed late to grade papers. As the clock struck midnight, he heard faint whispers coming from an empty classroom. When he stepped inside, the whispers stopped. He turned to leave but saw faint chalk writing appearing on the blackboard. "Help me." The next day, he learned about a student who had died mysteriously in that very classroom decades ago. Story 24. The Curse of the Tara Devi Temple Forest. A group of campers ventured into the dense forest near Tara Devi Temple for a night of adventure. Around 3 a.m., they saw a pair of glowing red eyes peering at them from the darkness. Their campfire flickered wildly, and a deep growl echoed through the trees. One of them ran and tripped, When he looked up, an old woman with sunken eyes stood over him. The next morning, locals warned them that the forest was cursed, haunted by an entity that despised trespassers. Story 25. The Vanishing Guest at Hotel Combermere. A businessman checked into an old suite at Hotel Combermere. That night, he heard someone knock on his door repeatedly, but when he opened it, the corridor was empty. The next morning, he asked the receptionist, who paled and told him that no one had stayed in that suite since a man mysteriously disappeared from it 5 years ago, his belongings left untouched, as if he had simply vanished. Story 26. The Haunting at the British Cemetery. A group of friends explored the British Cemetery in Sanjauli one evening. As they read the inscriptions, they noticed a woman in Victorian clothing standing near a grave, her eyes filled with sorrow. When they called out, she turned and disappeared into thin air. Later, they learned she was the ghost of a British woman who had lost her husband in the 1800s and had been buried beside him, forever mourning. Story 27. The Possessed Mirror of Lakkar Bazaar. An antique store in Lakkar Bazaar housed an old, ornate mirror that no one dared to buy. The shopkeeper claimed that every customer who looked into it for too long saw a dark figure staring back at them. A curious tourist ignored the warnings and took a selfie with the mirror. That night, he woke up to see the same dark figure standing at the foot of his bed, whispering his name. Story 28. The Lurking Shadow of Green Valley. A photographer capturing the stunning landscapes of Green Valley suddenly felt a chilling presence behind him. Assuming it was a fellow traveler, he turned, only to see a shadow with no body, stretching unnaturally tall. He fled, but his camera caught a final image, a dark figure with hollow eyes staring at him from the mist. Story 29. The Phantom Footsteps of Gaiety Theatre. An actor rehearsing alone in the historic Gaiety Theatre heard footsteps echoing on the empty stage. Thinking it was another crew member, he turned but saw nothing. The footsteps grew louder, circling him. Paralyzed with fear, he whispered, "Who's there?" A cold breath grazed his neck, and a disembodied voice replied, "Still waiting for my last act." Story 30. The Cursed Bride of Canlog Cemetery. A newlywed couple walking past Canlog Cemetery one night saw a woman in a bridal dress sitting on a bench, sobbing. The husband approached to ask if she needed help, but she lifted her veil, revealing a decayed skull. The couple screamed and ran. Locals later told them that she was a bride who had been left at the altar and took her own life, doomed to forever wait for her groom. Shimla's beauty hides a darker side, ghostly whispers, cursed houses, and restless spirits still lurking in the shadows. Do you dare visit these places at night? Let us know in the comments if you have experienced anything paranormal in Shimla. Until next time, sleep with your lights on, if you can.